Hello and welcome to HBM Crypto-Corner for Wednesday, June 22nd, 2022. We have a couple of things to talk about, so let's get started. First of all, we have a bit of a scathing review of Loch Ness being a boring, overhyped lake and says Nessie is a hoax. A U.S. travel writer blasted Loch Ness as a boring, overhyped lake and described Nessie as a hoax which does not exist. Writer and photographer Cameron Hewitt from Seattle posted the scathing review on Facebook after driving from Inverness to the Isle of Skye passing the loch. He said it was his professional duty to drive by the famous loch, but described it as the longest, deepest, most boring, and most overhyped lake he had ever seen. Cameron said there was nothing remotely interesting about Loch Ness, and Scots had come up with the fabricated story of Nessie to promote the giant waste of space. He insisted the Loch Ness Monster was not real and said it was empty hype invented in the 1930s to get people excited about a little stretch of the nothingness. The blogger said he didn't blame people for being curious about the loch and that visitors are up against a global conspiracy to drum up interest in a dumb lake. Cameron wrote, "Yesterday I drove from Inverness to the Isle of Skye across the middle of Scotland. I could have taken a scenic backroads route through little villages whose names you never heard of. But I had to drive along the longest, deepest, most boring, and most overhyped lake I've ever laid eyes on, simply because so many people want to see it. So therefore I had to see it too, as my professional duty." What's their excuse? Famous as it may be, there's nothing remotely interesting about Loch Ness once you're actually there. Loch Ness doesn't even crack the top 25 list of prettiest Scottish lochs. It's simply a long, narrow lake with a string of cheesy roadside attractions and not very dramatic mountains on the far side. It's almost as if the Scots, determined to wring a little touristic value out of this giant waste of space, at some point said, we should come up with some utterly fabricated story to get people who want to spend time and money there. There is no Loch Ness Monster, period. It does not exist, never has. It's just empty hype invented in the 1930s, kept alive by hoax after hoax, seemingly for no other reason than to get people excited about a little stretch of the nothingness contained within the Scottish interior. It's frustrating because there is so much to see in Scotland that's so much better than Loch Ness. But if you're taking a Highlands Highlights tour from Edinburgh or Inverness, it's practically obligatory to include this giant lake. Many of these tours even added on a pointless boat trip on the loch. If you choose to skip the boat trip, you save a little money. Then you waste a lot of time by having to wait around lakeside while the paying customers waste their time and their money on a boring lake trip, looking for something that no tourist in the history of tourism has ever actually seen in millions and millions of attempts, not once, not ever. I think I have such a chip on my shoulder partly because I find it insulting to the other great sights of Scotland, and its highlands the Loch Ness consumes far more than its share of oxygen. I like to imagine a parallel world where Loch Ness does not exist. In that world, people devote their time to so many other genuinely amazing attractions in this part of Scotland. I don't blame you for being curious to see Loch Ness. You're up against a massive, well-funded global campaign, if not conspiracy, to drum up some interest in this big, dumb lake. And for this reason, tour companies have to include Loch Ness because if they don't, everyone will complain. Yikes! Okay, so that's this guy's opinion. Interesting. Quite interesting. Now, is he right? Well, I don't know. But thousands of people have claimed to have seen Nessie over the years. And I hate to say it, but Loch Ness Monster was not invented during the 1930s. There were sightings even before then. It's like saying that Ray Wallace invented Bigfoot, which, no. No, Ray Wallace did not invent Bigfoot. But still, fascinating stuff, I have to say. Is Bigfoot real? Idaho State professor searches for Sasquatch. I've always been Sasquatch curious. I try to err on the side of believing stories of unexplained sightings and bumps in the night. As far as Bigfoot is concerned, if narwhals are real and giant squid, why not a few big hairy creatures wandering the woods of the Pacific Northwest? I can't prove their existence, but I like living in a Sasquatch positive paradigm. So when the opportunity to interview one of the foremost Sasquatch researchers presented itself, I hopped in the car and drove 3 hours to Pocatello to meet Professor Jeffrey Meldrum at Idaho State University. When I knocked on his office door, I expected an eccentric Dr. Emmett Brown type. Instead, I found a demure, soft-spoken man standing in a nondescript utilitarian lab, a bona fide scientist. Meldrum ended up being one of the most serious academic people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. He spent 2 hours using a lot of words I later had to Google to explain the scientific research supporting the existence of Bigfoot, an existence on which I am now sold. Meldrum's reluctant fascination with Bigfoot began in the 5th grade. His classmates were abuzz over footage captured by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin in Northern California. Patterson and Gimlin filmed a large, fur-covered ape-like creature, you may know her as Patty, standing on 2 legs. Meldrum convinced his dad to take him to the Spokane Coliseum, where Patterson was presenting his documentary and answering questions from the audience. Meldrum left the screening with a copy of Patterson's book, The Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist. If narwhals are real and giant squid, why not a few big hairy creatures wandering the woods of the Pacific Northwest? The next year, Meldrum and his 6th grade peers were studying primates. His long-suffering teacher asked the class to list some examples of primates, and a sassy 11-year-old suggested Bigfoot. Instead of dismissing the comment, she engaged with the students and suggested someone write a report on the creature. Meldrum's hand shot up immediately. He marched to the library to start the research that would eventually transform his career. Today, Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. According to his biographical sketch, his research encompasses questions of vertebrate evolutionary morphology generally, primate locomotor adaptations more particularly, and the emergence of modern human bipedalism. Like I said, I did a lot of Googling. Meldrum honed his research skills as he received a bachelor's degree in zoology from Brigham Young University, followed by a master's in zoology, then a doctorate in anatomical sciences from State University of New York. He topped it off with a postdoctoral visiting assistant professor post at Duke University Medical Center, a teaching position at Northwestern University Medical Center in Chicago, and finally he landed at Idaho State University, just close enough to the Pacific Northwest to investigate a subject area where other scholars feared to tread. During Meldrum's study of paleoprimatology, he came across a few obscure references to giant South American monkeys. He contacted Richard Greenwell, not Greenwall, Greenwell, director of the International Cryptid-Corner Society. Yes, that's a real thing, to find out more. Greenwell invited him to California to evaluate some video footage of a large ape-like creature. I undertook that project as an exercise in exposing the zipper, Meldrum says. He was convinced that a costumed man in an ape suit was traipsing through the woods, fooling all the eager believers. But the more I dug into it, the more intriguing it became. A friend Meldrum made in the Sasquatch searching circuit, once again a real thing, invited him to southeast Washington. It was there he saw Sasquatch footprints for the first time. His friend led him to a dirt road, along the side of which were impeccable footprints, too large to be human, too human to be animal. I was just flabbergasted, says Meldrum. Given his expertise, he's seen a good number of fossilized footprints and written extensive papers on various footprints from around the globe. His specific experience is matched only by a dozen or so other academics in the entire world, and these Sasquatch footprints looked as real as any he'd ever seen. The prints were what Meldrum calls animated tracks with pressure ridges, tension cracks, and proof of movement of the toes. Meldrum wondered how his friend had managed to fake such convincing footprints. I couldn't find the zipper, he said. He photographed and cast the prints, and then when he ultimately gave up trying to find the zipper, decided the Sasquatch had indeed walked along the road the night before. Meldrum tells me the hair on his arm stands up every time he tells the story. At that moment in his career, Meldrum had a choice to make. He had watched one of his predecessors, Grover Krantz, who had pursued the search for Sasquatch, receive ridicule and harassment. Krantz's promotion to full professor was delayed by decades. As Meldrum explains it, there was actually this little moment where this angel sits on my shoulder and says, "Do you really want to go down this path?" And the devil on the other shoulder says, "How can you not?" Meldrum now has over 300 Sasquatch footprint casts in his Pocatello lab, or more specifically, footprint casts from Sasquatch, Yeti, and other relic hominoids. When I look perplexed by the mention of multiple species of ape-like giants, Meldrum reaches for an activity book made for children, which unfortunately is probably entirely appropriate for my intellectual understanding of the subject matter. He points to a comparative chart with corresponding footprints. There's Sasquatch, Yeti, Neanderthal, and the Orang Pendek, small furry creatures said to inhabit the mountains of Indonesia. Meldrum's focus is on the Sasquatch found in North America. He believes they could live in areas where there is sufficient cover and habitat to support them. These happen to be the areas where black bears live, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but also in the Intermountain West and down in Utah, Idaho, and the Rocky Mountains. But he also believes that it could be the mountain ranges that surround the Colorado Plateau, the boreal forests of Canada, the Great Lakes region, and down through Appalachia. Credible Sasquatch sightings, he tells me, have been reported from all these areas. When he says credible, Meldrum means reports made under good conditions or by credible witnesses, often corroborated with footprints, hair, scat, or other signs of a large animal. According to Meldrum, there have been a couple thousand credible reports. Sightings are rare, he explains, because Sasquatch are few in number. He estimates there is one Sasquatch for every 100 black bears. Sasquatch are also solitary creatures, and Meldrum believes a single male inhabits and defends about 1,000 square miles. I asked him what he believes is the most credible Sasquatch sighting. He tells me about his friend Julie Davis. She hiked the entire Continental Divide Trail through Colorado, accompanied only by her pet goats and dogs. While she was bushwhacking to reach a remote lake, her dog's hackles raised, eyeing the tree line. She was prepared to encounter bears, but saw nothing. Thinking little of it, Davis set up camp. Later, the dogs began reacting to something, and again she assumed a bear was nearby. She scrambled to grab her bear spray and get the dog safely in the tent. Crawling out from under the rainfly, Davis found her goats peering over the tarp. Following their line of sight, she saw just 15 feet away an 8.5-foot tall Sasquatch. She described the Sasquatch's appearance to Meldrum as a big, hairy linebacker with bulging muscles. Davis, whose account was first published in the Denver Post in 2003, said the Sasquatch looked at her, then at the goats, then back at her. They then had a sort of a subliminal connection, and the Sasquatch's demeanor softened. Then a second smaller Sasquatch peeked out from behind the first. The two Sasquatch turned and walked away, the larger in the front and the smaller behind. They glided gracefully toward the tree line, and just before they were out of sight, the larger Sasquatch turned, cocked his head back and let out a high-pitched whistle. Meldrum himself has only had hints of sightings. The closest he's come was in Alberta, Canada, when he was using night vision binoculars in very low ambient light. Something approached the camp, breaking brush and making the characteristic whistling vocalizations along the way. Although it was difficult to see exact detail through the grainy night vision lens, Meldrum could make out large swinging arms attached to a large body, smoothly stomping through the area. The creature walked off into the forest, where Meldrum and his team later found 13-inch footprints. The Sasquatch had also taken the bait the team had set out the day before. Apples impaled on a tree branch, now gone, with giant footprints leading up to and away from the tree. So is Sasquatch human or animal, I asked, hoping to hear some weird, maybe slightly upsetting stories in response. Meldrum doesn't disappoint. He tells me about the Almasty, a creature that's said to inhabit the Altai Mountains of western Mongolia. They're rumored to wear clothing and trade with townspeople. In other words, more human than ape. Reports of the Sasquatch and Yeti, however, feel more akin to early sightings of the lowland gorilla, he says, a creature not officially discovered until the 1900s. But then there are some strange anecdotes that don't quite align with either classification. Like a story from World War II about a Russian surgeon called in to examine a prisoner captured during the war. The soldiers assumed that their prisoner had been surgically altered. He was covered in hair, had a heavy brow, and low-slung head with a barrel chest. He was presumed mute, as he had not uttered a word. When the surgeon saw him, he proclaimed he was, in fact, non-human and should be released in the wild. Meldrum reminds me that some of our oldest Western literary traditions feature half-man, half-creature protagonists, perhaps suggesting the idea of some kind of missing link. Think Beowulf or Spider-Man. Finally, because I just can't wait any longer, I ask the obvious question. Is Cain from the Bible Bigfoot? If anyone is qualified to verify or debunk this lore, it's this Latter-day Saint expert and academic who has spent the last 30 years researching Sasquatch. Meldrum laughs. The myth, as he explains it, tells the tale of the Latter-day Saint apostle David W. Patton walking alongside Bigfoot for 45 minutes. Given the rate a human walks, he says, and the rate a Sasquatch walks in reported sightings, the chances of Patton keeping up with the creature for so long is very unlikely. Plus, the published story was a second-hand account told 50 years after the alleged incident. So no, he says, Bigfoot is probably not Cain cursed to walk the earth for eternity. The Cain question is not the only quandary Meldrum gets from his fellow Latter-day Saints and other Christians. He says he gets pushback from some who think the existence of Sasquatch undermines their faith. To which Meldrum asks, do you feel threatened by a gorilla? He adds, it's a biological species, not some paranormal phenomenon, which is bad news for me, a weirdo who roots for confirmation of paranormal phenomena, but perhaps good news for the more serious Sasquatch believers among us. He also gets pushback from fellow academics, as the angel on his shoulder so many years ago predicted he would. Skeptics say the science starts when you have a body. Meldrum wholly disagrees. Bigfoot is probably not Cain cursed to walk the earth for eternity. The science starts when you have a question, he contends. The science is the process of discovery, not the result of discovery. Show me an atom, show me a string, show me a black hole, he argues, explaining that so much of science is the study of phenomena for which there is no body. It's an ongoing process, and we're at a point in that path to discovery that has been followed by many others before us. Meldrum leads me to his adjacent lab, littered with Sasquatch paraphernalia. There's a cutout of Patty, the ape-like creature filmed in Northern California, on the far wall, looking menacingly over her shoulder. He shows me a few footprint casts, pointing out the ridges and pressure points, and the varying toe positions. Then he pulls out a giant circular cast, with a raised center and two craters on either side. I look at him confused and ask, giant hooves? Meldrum giggles and says, no, Sasquatch posterior. It's exactly the kind of thing that I had hoped to see when I made the cross-state journey to his office. It was also the first time in our 2 hours together when felt I could meet Meldrum on his intellectual level, or perhaps he was willing to stoop to mine. In the end, this very serious and very academic man made me more believer than any eccentric ever could. So, a very interesting article about Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Good stuff, and very fair to the subject matter. I think so. Definitely good stuff for sure. No question about that. Definitely good stuff. You have to say. And that's going to do it for this week. I want to thank you very much for tuning in. You guys are the heart of the show. I always say that, but I always mean it. And I'll continue to do this as long as you guys want me to. And hey, until 2 weeks from now, y'all be good or be good dead. This is HBM's Crypto Corner.